This week's episode is brought to you by History Hit. Dan Snow's History Hit has published over 300 episodes of their podcast, and they also publish Art Detective as well as the History of the Unexpected. Their new website features video, podcasts, articles, and more to reinvent how history is told in the digital age. You can connect with them and learn more history, including a few articles on Shakespeare by yours truly, all at www.historyhit.com. This is episode 40 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I am Emily Ison, Townhouse Steward at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. Another great method for studying William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
There was more relatively late marriage in this period than we thought. People didn't marry in their early teens. And there was a sizable percentage of people, women and men, who never did get married.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
From Merry Wives of Windsor to Measure for Measure, All's Well That Ends Well, and others, the role of marriage plays a big role in Shakespeare's plays. It can determine the action, define the characters, and it lives on several assumptions about the marriage institution. But what are those assumptions exactly? And as a modern audience member, what do we need to know about marriage in Shakespeare's lifetime and how it's changed over the last 400 years when we step into the theater? Will understanding these changes impact how we receive Shakespeare's stories? Here to help us find the answers to these questions and explore the history of marriage in Shakespeare's lifetime, as well as his own marriage to Anne Hathaway, and what we can take away from the displays of marriage in Shakespeare's plays, is our special guest, Frances Dolan. Frances is a distinguished professor of English at UCDavis. Her work focuses on Shakespeare and his contemporaries. From 2004 to 2005, she served as the president of the Shakespeare Association of America. She has held fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities at the Newberry Library, and the Folger Library, as well as the Monticello College Foundation. In November of 2018, she led a Folger Weekend Seminar on agriculture in the 16th century, and she's the author of the article Shakespeare and Marriage for UCDavis that we have invited her here to speak with us about today. Frances, welcome to the show.
I'm delighted to be here.
William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway were expecting Susanna when they were married. And Frances, how common was it in the 16th century for women to be pregnant when they got married?
Well, the historian Peter Laslett has studied church records, and he finds that in England, between 10 and 46% of first births were within 8 months of the registry of the couple's marriage. So that's a pretty high percentage. Of course, that evidence always has its own problems, right? So that depends on a couple choosing to register their marriage and their birth. It depends on them being members of the Church of England, staying in the same parish. Nevertheless, it's pretty telling evidence that a lot of women were pregnant when they got married. And in Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, you have the novice Isabella, who in many ways takes a very high line on sexual morality, saying of her brother Claudia, "What a marrier," as if that's just the obvious solution to the problem of pregnancy outside of marriage.
Which is not at all the impression we get typically of the 16th century. When we read about, Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway being pregnant, we want to think this was a remarkable situation or something that didn't happen often. And the historical evidence kind of contradicts that, don't you think? Right.
The historical evidence suggests that it's actually extremely common. I mean, 46% is a high rate.
It is. It's a very high rate. And I wonder if that means, was pregnancy a kind of marriage contract? I mean, if you became pregnant, did it always follow that a woman would marry the man with whom she'd had a relationship?
Unfortunately, no. So in some ways, what it shows us is that people had sex outside of marriage, and it was a world without birth control or reliable ways of controlling fertility. So the treatment of pregnancy outside of wedlock could be really harsh. And when it was, that punishment overwhelmingly landed on women. So the issue, what people cared about, what the society cared about, was who will pay for what were called bastards chargeable to the parish. That is, children born outside of wedlock. Who's going to support them? So midwives were required to try to get the name of the father out of a woman before they would assist her giving birth, because the church and the state really wanted to know who's the father, who can be held responsible. But we have evidence of, for instance, women who were not married and didn't have anyone to take care of them going into labor, and people in a parish trying to drive them over the boundary of the parish so that they would give birth in another parish that would have to take responsibility for them and their baby.
That's amazing to me that the woman would bear the brunt of the scorn and the ridicule, but it was the man who was expected to be financially responsible for this child's upbringing.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And of course, they knew who the mother was, and they couldn't be sure who the father was. That uncertainty is so central to Shakespeare's plays and so central to the culture. And for us at a time when people casually take DNA tests, it's kind of unimaginable how much uncertainty there was around who the father was. So a man could simply deny it, and he might be able to get away with that. So women had a lot of vulnerability in pregnancy. So far from becoming a marriage contract, pregnancy, not only were there relatively high levels of mortality in childbirth for women, but a woman could be very socially vulnerable if she became pregnant. And a lot of women who were pregnant outside of marriage were pregnant by, say, their employers. And that man might already be married. The woman would be driven out of the household. So it could be a very, very dangerous and vulnerable position for women.
Well, let's look at one of Shakespeare's characters, because we're talking about illegitimate children, and it is a theme that shows up actually a lot in Shakespeare's plays, with Philip the Bastard, who ends up being a pretty cool guy, actually. But then there's Edmund and King Lear, who actually says, he begs the gods to stand up for the bastards. And I wonder... that's just a wide range of options on what an illegitimate child was. So when we're going to the theater and we're seeing King Lear or King John as a 21st century audience member, what are we supposed to recognize, or what would it help us to recognize when we're seeing these plays about the reality of legitimizing your children in the 16th century?
Well, it's interesting that, as you say, there are a number of acknowledged bastards. Edmund's a great example, right? He is a bastard, and yet Gloucester acknowledges that he's his father. That would give him a certain kind of status, but he wouldn't have a status equal to Edgar, his brothers, his half-brothers. So illegitimate children would depend on the willingness of a father to acknowledge them. And they would never have the same social status or claims on property that legitimate children would have. And there's already primogeniture as well. That is, the oldest son gets most of the perks. And you see that in a play like As You Like It, the conflict between the oldest son and the younger son. So I think that there's enormous stigma attached to being illegitimate, and it really can warp your possibilities in this social world. So, and when you look at Shakespeare's plays, you see that there are a lot of bastards, and there's a kind of acknowledgement that a lot of people are born out of wedlock. On the other hand, when you look at Edmund, when you look at Don John and Much Ado, they're often villains.
Yeah, they're not these favorite people. Well, we know that with illegitimate children, there's a stigma. But I wonder about the women and the role of women in marriage, because, at least in my estimation, and you tell me if I'm reading a 21st century outlook on women into Shakespeare's plays that maybe isn't there, because I want to allow that might be possible. But when I look at Shakespeare's plays, the women that he portrays seem pretty strong and pretty in control of their own destiny, at least in the decisions that they make. But how much of that is really there?
I think, first, yes, I think it's right to see that women have all kinds of power. There's room to maneuver in their cultural position, and they know how to take that. One specialist in women's legal rights says women can shift it well enough. Women know how to figure out what the possibilities are for them in their social situation. And women can even survive having children outside of wedlock. We know of women in the court, for instance, or aristocratic women. A great example is the woman writer Margaret Cavendish's mother had one child out of wedlock and only married the father 6 years later and survived that, went on to be the matriarch at the head of a big aristocratic family. So it was survivable, but I think that when you, again, recognize there was no way to prove paternity, and paternity entailed financial responsibility for children, having a child out of wedlock tended not to empower women. It tended to make them enormously vulnerable. On the other hand, the law stated that children born within wedlock were legitimate. So even if a husband suspected that his wife's child wasn't his, he couldn't prove it, and the law was not that interested in that. It felt you had that child, that's your child. You're responsible for that child. So I think we have two issues here. First, in a culture that is really interested in patrilineage and how you hand on names, estates, wealth, and property, legitimacy matters a great deal. On the other hand, they know that they can't know exactly what paternity is, and this is one of the kinds of power that women have. Everything in the culture depends on reproduction and a woman's ability to reproduce. That can make you vulnerable, as with Henry VIII's wives, but it's also a form of enormous power. And as you're suggesting, it's not the only kind of power women have. Women have all kinds of influence in the culture.
Yeah,
and there's a queen on the throne, right?
Right, exactly. I was going to say that. But this level of power in marriage, there is kind of an independence that gets discussed, because in Merry Wives of Windsor, Mistress Quickly talks about Mistress Page, and she goes on this, it's like a tirade about how she has this better life because she can do what she wants to do. And that suggestion is that it's uncommon for a wife to enjoy a high level of independence within a marriage in the 16th century. And I want to know, if it was that remarkably uncommon, was Anne Hathaway, who was Shakespeare's wife, and she lived in Stratford by herself, raising the kids, taking care of the house for the better part of his career, was she a rarity?
Well, I think to say that the independence that is associated with Mistress Page is easier to achieve when your husband's not there is absolutely true.
Sure. Yeah.
And it's not, but Shakespeare's reasons for not being in Stratford may have been unique to him, but all kinds of husbands weren't at home. There were the husbands who were at sea. There were the husbands who traveled for business, husbands who were at war. Many very high status people had multiple homes. During the Civil War, all kinds of people went to Europe, and sometimes they brought their wives and families, and sometimes they didn't. So the fact that when a husband is out of the house, everyone, the most conservative social commentators say, the wife is the lieutenant. She's the one who's in charge when he's not there. So that means that absence is a kind of opportunity in some ways for women. And women also have their own set of obligations. So many of the writers in this period about marriage talk about a kind of gender division of labor, where they imagine that women have particular authority within the home to govern, to take care of money, to make financial decisions, to oversee children and servants. So, if they have a kind of cottage industry, women are often running that little family business. So there's a lot of authority that women have when husbands are around, and there is a special opportunity that's afforded by husbands who aren't home. And I think we can imagine Anne Hathaway seizing upon that kind of opportunity.
Were marriages still arranged between families during Shakespeare's lifetime? Or for Anne Hathaway, for example, did she choose to be married to William Shakespeare? Can we ascribe some romance to that relationship, or was that a marriage of opportunity given her higher status than Shakespeare was at the time?
I think that the most carefully arranged marriages are at the very highest part of the social hierarchy, because that's when the families have the biggest investment in making alliances between families, even between countries in the case of royals, linking estates that are near each other. So what we think of as the family arrangement of a marriage, especially happens up at the top of the social hierarchy. What makes that interesting, since parents are enormously invested in their children's marriages in this period, is how many of the young people in Shakespeare's plays transact their own unions. He's really most interested in people choosing their own spouses. That's at the center of so many of the plays. So it's interesting to see that individual choice is in some ways emerging in this period as something that's important. People are defending it as important. Ministers are arguing that parents should not push their children to marry people they're not interested in. But Shakespeare keeps telling us the story of love and desire. So it's hard to, we don't really know what the family investment was in that marriage. But I think we can imagine that at some level they choose to have sex together, she gets pregnant, and they choose to get married. And there were other possibilities. So I don't think people to imagine no romance there. I think there must have been some desire and choice.
Well, that's fun. I'm personally very glad to hear that, because I would like to think it's all very romantic. But of course, when you study history, there are a lot of generalizations, and as many generalizations as there are also exceptions. And so, as you say, you can't know precisely, but you can conclude a few things. Now, one.
Wait, could I just say one more thing about that, if I may?
Absolutely. Yes.
It's just that when you put it that way, what I want to say is that some of what we can't know about history, I completely share your investment in looking to history to help us understand Shakespeare as a person and Shakespeare's plays better. That is definitely my passion as well. And sometimes when we can't be sure about something, when history won't tell us absolutely this is why they got married or this is how they got married, the uncertainty I think of as a kind of opportunity for us to speculate and imagine. And we can speculate and imagine a desire for one another in them. Why not? There's no reason we shouldn't do that. This is a side note, I guess, but I've seen clips of Kenneth Branagh's latest film, All Is True. I haven't seen the whole thing yet, but one of the things that he does in that movie is to capitalize on imagining the parts that we don't know. So it leads to certainly historically based art to take that perspective. But now with Anne Hathaway and Shakespeare, though, and when you visit Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in England, there's a chair there at Anne Hathaway's cottage called the Wooing Chair. And the historical guides who you'll meet when you walk through there, they tell you that this was the chair William Shakespeare sat in to woo Anne Hathaway. Now, I don't know many modern dating couples who still use the word woo outside of a Hallmark card. So can you explain what it might have meant for a man to woo a woman for marriage in the 16th century? Well, it often involved being observed. So a lot of what we think of as dating behavior isn't always available to people in the Renaissance. So you might come and visit a young woman and there might be someone observing you. You would talk, you would give gifts. Gift giving and gift exchange seems to be enormously important in courtship in this period. But that word woo that you draw attention to, it's interesting, it occurs 79 times in Shakespeare, most often in True, more in True than any other play. And it is a word that means convince, persuade, court, seduce. It also is used for the relationships between animals, for animals breeding, starting in the 14th century. And it's applied to persuasions that aren't only sexual. You can woo someone to try to convince them to do something you want them to do.
Oh, so it's any kind of convincing. I see.
Yes, it seems to expand to have that meaning. But in True, it's something that the other men think they can get Petruchio to do. Petruchio uses the word too, but they think, we'll get him to woo Catherine. So it's actually quite, you that chair draws attention to it as quite an interesting verb for what happens. But it's often conversation, compliments, getting to know one another, exchanging gifts. That's kind of the process.
Frances mentions in her article both that marriages, quote, used to be deemed inevitable, but also that marriage was, quote, not a given. Now, Frances, one of the aspects of marriage in Shakespeare's lifetime that I wanted to ask you about was this idea of whether or not for women, marriage was an inevitability. Was it considered the everyone does this idea?
It's a great question. And when I say, they used to be deemed inevitable, what I mean is that scholars of Shakespeare, teachers of Shakespeare, used to say, well, everyone gets married, because sometimes my students would say, oh, what's the rush at the end of this comedy? Couldn't this Shakespearean heroine get a job in a studio apartment and date for a while? Why does she have to rush into getting married? And
why is it always a studio apartment? Like, I'm going, have you been inside a studio apartment? She can think bigger.
But they would imagine, what they were imagining as a post-college possibility. Why couldn't Shakespeare's heroines have that? Why is their happy ending always marriage? And my response used to be, well, pretty much everyone did get married. And then we started to see more research. Scholars started to do more research on actual marriage rates. And we found that there was more relatively late marriage in this period than we thought. People didn't marry in their early teens. That there was a sizable percentage of people, women and men, who never did get married, partly because many people assumed you had to have money to get married. So the younger sons, for instance, in families, even well-to-do families, might not have enough money to marry. Or some women, there's a sizable percentage of women who didn't marry. So it's not as if everyone got married. And there was also, of course, once there's the Reformation and the dissolution of the monasteries, the closing of convents, women lose that alternative to marriage. Some English women actually go to the continent to join convents. So there are other things that people do. And of course, again, we have Elizabeth I on the throne, never marrying.
Who did not get married, exactly.
Yeah, so it's not as if it's the only thing. But I think it is also important to say it's usually the best option for marriage, for women. Marriage is usually the best option for women in terms of giving them financial security, ensuring the legitimacy of their children should they be sexually active, connecting them to larger networks of people. So the women who don't marry tend to, if they're not the queen or if they're not an aristocrat, they tend to be more vulnerable to poverty, et cetera.
Which, if you don't know, some of the things that Frances is referring to there would be that women couldn't hold jobs. There was only a few jobs that women held, and those were kind of allowed for people like widows who were in a unique situation. So I assume, Frances, that's what you're talking about. The kind of thing that you're talking about when you say it was more financially stable to be married is because a woman independently didn't have a lot of options for taking care of herself.
Right. Women could work, and women worked as servants, but they didn't have, those jobs could be extremely vulnerable. They were very hard work. You could be cast out. They didn't make that much money. So there were jobs for women, but they were very low-level jobs. And so it was often better for a woman not to move up, for instance, from working as a servant to being a wife and having her own household.
Well, I know we would love to learn more about this topic and explore marriage in the 16th century and how it applies to Shakespeare. Are there books or resources that are some of your favorites that you could recommend to us?
Absolutely. There are so many wonderful histories of marriage, sex and marriage. A classic is Lawrence Stone's Family, Sex and Marriage in England. David Cressey's Birth, Marriage, and Death is another great book. And I want to actually recommend my own book, which is called Marriage and Violence, The Early Modern Legacy, which is about how certain ideas about marriage that we see in the 16th and 17th centuries still inform some of our own expectations.
Oh, excellent. Thank you for mentioning that, because I found you through an article that you wrote, and I actually didn't know about your book, and I'm excited to go check that out.
Thanks.
Well, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what is the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? Now, my friends in England tell me I am supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, this is like torturing an English professor. Because,
I know.
I need to bring a mobile library with me to the desert island. But since I have Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, I think I'm going to take the Norton Anthology of English Renaissance Drama, because I love reading Shakespeare in relation to all those other plays by his contemporaries, read or performed as much now as they used to be. And I think he's so much in dialogue with them. And I think that could keep me busy on the desert island for quite a while.
Excellent choice. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I'm working on agriculture, because I live here in the middle of agriculture in California, but I'm thinking about the relationship between agriculture in Shakespeare's period and various kinds of agricultural reforms and alternatives now. So the book is called Digging the Past, How and Why to Imagine 17th Century Agriculture.
That's fascinating. Are there links online that we can link to that tell more about that?
My website at UCDavis has a lot of my publications that you can just download from there. That's probably the fastest way to get.
Excellent. Okay, yeah, we will definitely link to that in the show notes for today's episode. Well, Frances Dolan, Distinguished Professor of English Literature at the University of California, Davis, we thank you so much for spending some time with us today and helping us explore marriage and Shakespeare.
Thank you.
To see links to the books and resources mentioned in today's episode, be sure to check out the full show notes. There's a lot of history and research that we pack into the show notes because we're not able to cover everything related to Shakespeare and marriage in a single episode. So be sure you jump over to the website and visit CassidyCash.com/episode 40. That's CassidyCash.com/EP40. Don't forget, you can support the work we do here at That Shakespeare Life by shopping at CassidyCash.com and checking out the link to our sponsors. That's it for this week here at That Shakespeare Life. I'm Cassidy Cash, that Shakespeare girl, and I hope your week is a Shakespeare-filled week.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.